On the morning of May 29, 1453, as Ottoman forces breached the walls of Constantinople, the last emperor of Byzantium threw off his imperial regalia, drew his sword, and charged into the fighting on foot. His body was never identified with certainty. He died as a soldier, not as a captive, not as a negotiator, as a man who had decided that the fall of his city was also the end of him, and that the manner of the ending was the last thing left within his control. Constantine XI Palaiologos had been emperor for 4 years. He had inherited an empire that was, in every meaningful sense, already finished, a city-state of perhaps 50,000 people surrounded by Ottoman territory, without allies capable of sending real help, without money to pay adequate troops, without the population to man the walls that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years. He knew this when he accepted the purple. He accepted it anyway. What he did in those 4 years, and in the 53 days of the final siege, was not enough to save his empire. It was enough to give it a death worth remembering. The distinction matters, because the memory of how Byzantium ended has shaped Greek, Orthodox Christian, and broadly European consciousness for 5.5 centuries, and it shaped it because of how Constantine XI chose to die. The Palaiologos, an empire of ghosts. The Palaiologos dynasty that Constantine XI represented had ruled Byzantium since 1261, when Michael VIII Palaiologos had retaken Constantinople from the Latin emperors installed by the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The recovery was real but incomplete. The empire Michael reclaimed was a fraction of the Byzantine state that had existed before 1204, and the decades of Latin occupation had stripped it of territories, populations, and institutional continuity that could not be recovered. By the time Constantine XI was born in 1405, the empire had been reduced further by Ottoman expansion and by the internal dynastic conflicts that Byzantine political culture seemed constitutionally unable to avoid. His father Mehmed II had spent his reign in an exhausting combination of military defense, diplomatic begging across Europe, and the management of brothers who periodically rebelled against his authority. Constantine grew up watching his father travel to Paris, London, and other Western capitals in person, seeking help that never came in sufficient quantity, and maintaining the dignity of the imperial office in circumstances that made dignity an act of sustained will rather than a natural expression of power. The empire Constantine XI inherited in 1449 consisted essentially of Constantinople itself, with a few scattered territories in the Peloponnese. The Ottoman Sultan Murad II had been gradually absorbing the remnants of Byzantine territory for decades. His son Mehmed II, who came to the throne in 1451 at the age of 19, had Constantinople as his primary ambition from the beginning of his reign, a goal that was simultaneously strategic, symbolic, and personal. He wanted the city that had resisted every attacker for 11 centuries. He built the fortress of Rumeli Hizari on the European shore of the Bosphorus in 1452. In Byzantine territory, without asking permission, as a statement of intent that Constantine could not militarily prevent. Mehmed II, the 21-year-old who wanted Constantinople. Mehmed II was, by any measure, one of the most formidable rulers of the 15th century. He was educated, multilingual, he reportedly spoke 6 languages, deeply read in history and military strategy, and possessed of an ambition calibrated precisely to the resources he commanded. He had been sultan once before, briefly, and had been removed by the Janissary Corps who found him insufficiently experienced. He returned to power after his father's death with the lessons of that removal clearly internalized. He immediately had his infant half-brother strangled to eliminate a rival claimant, and he spent the following years consolidating control of the military before turning to his great project. The strategic case for taking Constantinople was straightforward. The city sat astride the connection between the Ottoman territories in Europe and those in Asia Minor, and as long as a hostile or potentially hostile power held it, the empire's communications were theoretically vulnerable. The symbolic case was even more compelling. Constantinople was the city of Roman emperors, the center of Orthodox Christianity, the place that had resisted Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, and every other attacker. Taking it would confirm Mehmed's claim to be the greatest sultan who had ever lived, and would announce Ottoman power to every court in the world. His key military innovation was artillery. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build cannon of unprecedented size, the largest reportedly throwing stone balls weighing several hundred kilograms at ranges that the defenders could not match. Urban had first offered his services to Constantine XI, who could not afford him. He then went to Mehmed, who could, and the cannon he built were decisive. The siege, 53 days. The Ottoman army that appeared before Constantinople in April 1453 numbered, by various estimates, between 60,000 and 100,000 men. The Byzantine garrison consisted of approximately 7,000 defenders. Roughly 5,000 Byzantine troops and 2,000 Genoese volunteers under the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who had come to Constantinople with 700 soldiers on his own initiative, motivated by a combination of Christian solidarity and military adventurism. There were also Venetian sailors and some Catalan troops from ships that happened to be in the harbor. The walls of Constantinople. The Theodosian walls, built in the 5th century, triple-layered, extending more than 5 kilometers, had never been breached by an external attacker in their 1,000-year history. They were the reason Constantinople had survived when every other major city in the eastern Mediterranean had fallen to various invaders. But they had been built for a pre-artillery world, and the massive Ottoman cannon could do to stone what no previous weapon had managed. Constantine XI directed the defense with the personal engagement of a man who understood that the quality of the resistance was as important as its outcome. He moved constantly along the walls, supervising repairs carried out under fire, maintaining the morale of troops who could see the Ottoman camp stretching to the horizon, managing the relationships between the various national contingents who had different languages and sometimes different interests. Giustiniani was an invaluable partner. A professional soldier of real ability, and Constantine delegated the tactical management of the most threatened sections to him while maintaining overall command and the symbolic function of imperial presence. The diplomatic effort continued throughout the siege. Constantine sent messages to Venice, Genoa, and the Pope, asking for the military relief that he knew probably would not come. He also confronted the internal religious controversy that had complicated Byzantine relations with the West for decades, the question of church union between Rome and Constantinople, which a council at Florence in 1439 had formally agreed to but which the Byzantine clergy and population largely rejected. In December 1452, Cardinal Isidore celebrated a union mass in Hagia Sophia. The population's response was largely hostile. The famous line attributed to the Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, "Better the Sultan's turban than the Cardinal's hat," captures the mood, though historians debate whether he actually said it. The Last Night, a liturgy before the end. The night of May 28 to 29, 1453, is one of the most documented and most dramatically charged nights in Byzantine history. Constantine XI knew the final assault was coming. Ottoman preparations were visible and audible throughout the evening. And he spent it in a sequence of acts that read, in retrospect, as a conscious preparation for death. He rode along the walls one final time, inspecting the defenses, speaking to the soldiers. Greek, Genoese, Venetian, Catalan, he addressed each group in their own language, thanking them for their service, asking them to stand firm. Then he returned to the palace, where he reportedly summoned his officials and household and asked forgiveness of anyone he had wronged. The gesture has a specifically Byzantine quality, the emperor performing the liturgical act of reconciliation before death, making his earthly relationships right before the moment of judgment. He then went to Hagia Sophia for what would be the last Christian liturgy ever celebrated in the great church. The service drew together the city's defenders and its civilians in a way that transcended the theological controversy over church union. On this night, in this place, the divisions were set aside. Byzantine and Latin Christians received communion together. Contemporary accounts describe the church filled with people who understood they might be receiving the sacrament for the last time, in a building they would never enter again. Constantine received communion, returned to the palace briefly, and then rode to the walls. At some point in the early morning hours, he reportedly turned to those around him and said words to the effect that the city was falling and there was nothing more to be done. He asked that anyone who wished to save himself should do so. Then he rode toward the sound of the fighting. The speech that may or may not have been spoken. Several sources, Greek, Italian, and later. Preserve what purports to be Constantine's final address to his troops and officials, delivered either in the days before the final assault or on the night itself. The speech varies significantly between sources, and most historians treat the surviving versions as reconstructions rather than transcriptions. But the themes that appear consistently across all versions tell us something real about how contemporaries understood what Constantine was doing and why. In all versions, he acknowledges the situation honestly: the city is outnumbered, help is not coming, the walls are damaged, the outcome is likely. In all versions, he invokes four things as reasons to fight: faith, the empire, the emperor, and freedom, the specific combination of Christian identity, Roman imperial tradition, personal loyalty, and the liberty of a free people that defined Byzantine self-understanding. In all versions, he expresses no expectation of surviving and no desire to do so in circumstances of defeat or captivity. The phrase most consistently attributed to him, "The city is falling but I am still alive," appears in some accounts as a lament spoken in the final moments of the defense, as the walls were breached and the situation became irretrievable. Whether these were his actual words or words the tradition needed him to have spoken, they capture something precise. The identification of the emperor with the city, the understanding that his existence and its existence were the same thing, and the decision that followed from that understanding. The fall, May 29, 1453. The final assault began in the early hours of May 29. The Ottoman forces attacked along the entire length of the land walls simultaneously, with the main effort concentrated at the Blacherny section in the northwest, where the walls were somewhat weaker and the cannon damage most severe. 3 waves of attackers, first irregular troops, then Anatolian regulars, then the elite janissaries, struck the defenses in succession, each wave wearing down the defenders further. The turning point came when Giustiniani was wounded. The accounts disagree about whether the wound was severe or relatively minor, but its psychological effect was decisive. He asked Constantine for permission to leave the walls to have the wound treated. Constantine reportedly begged him to stay, understanding what his departure would mean for morale. Giustiniani left anyway. The Genoese troops who had been holding the most critical section, seeing their commander carried off the field, began to waver. At approximately the same time, Ottoman forces discovered or forced open a small postern gate called the Kirkaporta, which had been left unlocked, whether by accident or treachery is disputed. A group of janissaries entered through it and appeared behind the defenders on the walls. The word spread that the Turks were inside. The defense collapsed in sections, defenders abandoning the walls to try to reach the gates and escape into the city or to the harbor. The janissaries reached the top of the walls and raised the Ottoman standard. Constantine XI, according to all accounts, did not attempt to escape. He shed his imperial purple, removing the mark that would have identified him and made him a valuable prisoner, drew his sword, and led a final charge into the Ottoman troops pouring through the breach. He disappeared into the fighting. His body was never recovered with complete certainty. Mehmed II, who wanted to display the emperor's head as proof of victory, had to accept a head identified by the imperial purple boots that had been found on the corpse. A detail that leaves open the possibility that the identification was incorrect. Mehmed and the ruins of memory. Mehmed II entered Constantinople on the afternoon of May 29. His first act was to ride to Hagia Sophia, where he reportedly dismounted, took a handful of earth and sprinkled it over his turban, a gesture of humility before God, and had the Islamic call to prayer recited in the building. Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The city became the capital of the Ottoman Empire under its new name, Istanbul, though Ottoman documents continued to use Constantini for centuries. Mehmed's response to Constantine XI is reported in several sources, and it is remarkable for its ambivalence. He is said to have wept over the emperor's death, or the body identified as his, saying that the man who had defended his city so courageously deserved better than to die in the rubble of its fall. He reportedly had the head displayed on a column in the Hippodrome, but then had it sent to the Eastern Patriarchs as confirmation of the city's fall. Whatever his personal feelings about the man he had defeated, he understood the significance of what Constantine had done and the way it would be remembered. He was right to understand it. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was immediately recognized across Europe as an event of civilizational significance. The end of the Roman Empire that had persisted in one form or another for 15 centuries. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade. Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, the future Pope Pius II, wrote that it was a second death for Homer and Plato, since their works, preserved in Constantinople, were now in danger. Greek scholars who fled the city carried manuscripts to Italy, contributing to the Renaissance in ways that historians have traced in detail. The Marble Emperor, a legend that would not die. Constantine's body was never definitively identified. This fact, combined with the traumatic scale of the loss for Greek and Orthodox Christian consciousness, generated one of the most enduring legends in the history of the Byzantine tradition, the story of the Marble Emperor, the Marmarminos Vasilios. According to the legend, Constantine XI did not die on the walls of Constantinople. At the moment of the final breach, an angel appeared and carried him away, turning him to marble, preserving him in a cave beneath the Golden Gate of the city, where he sleeps, waiting. When the time comes, when the Greeks are ready to reclaim their city and their empire, the angel will return, restore him to flesh, hand him his sword, and he will rise and lead his people back through the Golden Gate to Constantinople. The legend emerged within decades of the fall and has persisted in Greek folk consciousness ever since. It draws on a pan-cultural tradition of the sleeping king who will return in the hour of need, Arthur in Britain, Frederick Barbarossa in Germany, Sebastian in Portugal, but it carries a specific charge in the Greek context, because it is connected to a real historical event with a real historical date, and because the city it promises to recover is real and still exists and is still inhabited. The Greek War of Independence in the 19th century invoked the legend repeatedly. Every subsequent crisis in Greek-Turkish relations has brought it back. When the government of Greece and the Ecumenical Patriarchate wished to make a statement about the status of Constantinople, which remains, in Orthodox Christian understanding, the seat of the Ecumenical Patriarch, the image of Constantine XI and the Marble Emperor carries weight that purely political arguments cannot achieve. He ruled for 4 years. He held a city with 7,000 men against 80,000. He died in the rubble of his empire rather than surrender or escape. His body was never found. And he has been waiting, in marble, under the Golden Gate, for 5.5 centuries. The waiting, by the standards of what he actually did, seems entirely in character.